Well, as we've been reporting, members of the United Nations in New York have announced a tentative blueprint to help developing countries affected by the global financial crisis. After weeks of intense negotiations, rich and poor nations have agreed on a 15-page document ahead of the summit on the crisis and its impact on development. Well, I'm joined now from our studio at the United Nations in New York by Ambassador Camillo Gonsalves, who is the representative for St. Vincent and the Grenadines at the UN and who's been involved in drawing up this draft document. Ambassador, can you tell us what the main points are that have been agreed?
Certainly. The United Nations to date has not been obviously very deeply involved in some of the solutions emanating from the G20 and other developed nations for addressing the financial crisis. And the idea is to get, since this is a global problem, to have a global solution. And so the main thrust of the document is to have the involvement of the United Nations with sensitivities to all of the multiplicities of problems that the world faces that are all connected in some way to this crisis. So one is to get the United Nations involved to list the causes and impacts of the crisis and the specific ways in which we, speaking as a developing country, think that the world community must be involved in helping to address some of the issues in the crisis.
Now the run-up to these negotiations were quite acrimonious, weren't they? Because some rich countries felt that this was an attempt to put capitalism on trial, if you like. Do you think that's fair?
I think initially there was a fear because there was not, while there was agreement for the conference, there wasn't really an agreement on the goals of the conference. So over the course of the negotiations that we had, we came together. Initially there was that fear that this was capitalism on trial, but the developing countries are very much concerned with bread and butter issues. But they're also concerned that having done sort of everything right, they've followed all the rules, they're still being affected by the crisis even though they didn't cause it. So they do want some structural reforms, but the idea was not to put capitalism on trial. Indeed, most of us are capitalists.
Isn't the problem, though, always with these summits, is that the rich nations come along and go, yeah, we'll give you some more aid, and then they don't pay up? I mean, look at what happened in Glen Eagles at the G8 summit a couple of years back when these grand promises were made about helping sub-Saharan Africa, and most of that money, I think less than a third, has actually been paid.
That is true, and that is a very serious concern, and it goes in many ways to the credibility and legitimacy of some of these gatherings, where developed countries gather and make promises, but are not held to account by the larger world community. This conference one of the headlines from this conference will not be X number of dollars dedicated to developing countries. This conference obviously speaks to that need, but it's not a donors conference. It's not a financing for development conference. We acknowledge those needs, but we also acknowledge the need for more structural adjustments in the architecture of the financial system and some of the particular concerns of different groups, including small island states, African states, and the least developed countries. But the idea is not to throw money at this problem, but to examine it more deeply and hopefully overcome it collectively.
Ambassador Gonsalves, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, the global financial crisis is starting to hit Cuba's state-run economy, but unlike other nations, Cuba can't spend its way out of the crisis, so it's having to resort to other measures, as Michael Voss